Hi, this is Patty Hodge, and this is Dr. Nurses Rock. And this video is part of a series that we're doing on grief throughout the month of April this year. Today, our special guest is Liz Wolczko. Liz is a bereaved mom, sibling, and daughter. Her journey with grief began in 1974 with the death of her oldest brother, John, in a car accident at the age of 24. Liz's story with grief is extensive, and I don't want to take her time away by reading it to you. I want her to tell you about it. But most notably, Liz and her mother were pioneers in the hospice movement. And so she's taken her grief and moved it out into the world to help people. And I want her to tell her story. So welcome to you, Liz Wolczko.
Good, Patty. Thank you. I know my last name is a tough one, um, to say the least, but he's worth it. Yeah, I had two older brothers and a much younger sister. In 1974, my oldest brother, John, was living in Cambridge. We were living in D.C., or the D.C. area, Bethesda, Maryland. And he was a bartender in a bar in Boston. And he worked late one night and he was driving home and unfortunately fell asleep at the wheel. And he was on the wrong side of the road. And so the accident was actually his fault, but he hit a car full of drunk teenagers. And we've always wondered if they hadn't been, would the accident have happened? But doesn't matter. It's what happened. And he lived for 2 days after his accident, but his brain waves were gone because he had hit his head on the roll bar of his Austin Healey Sprite. And Massachusetts had just passed a law in 1974 saying if your brain waves are gone for 48 hours, you can pull the plug, or the plug can be pulled. He was the first one in the state of Massachusetts they did that for, because my mother said he wouldn't want to be alive as a vegetable. And my mom and dad had to fly up from D.C., and when my mom got into the room, he was attached to all these machines. And the nurse explained them all and then said, you know, the last sense that goes is the sense of hearing. Talk to him. He'll hear you. So she looked down at him and said, well, you son of a bitch, look what you got yourself into this time. And his eyes flickered.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's something my mom held on to for most of her life, I believe, the rest of her life. But afterwards, it changed the whole dynamics of our family. My other brother, Jeff, went back to college as soon as he could because he couldn't deal with any of this. So I was 19. I was left with my parents trying to figure out how to grieve because back in 1974, grieving really wasn't talked about at all. You were just supposed to suck it up and move on. Well, my mom wanted to talk about John and relate things and remember things, and my dad just wanted to look at pictures. So I became the go-between. I listened to my mom and I looked at pictures with my dad. And in the meantime, I had a 9-year-old sister who needed a parent of some kind. So I kind of became her parent. That went on for probably a couple years. And then, it doesn't really matter. And then a neighbor of ours came to me and my mom and said, look, I've just been diagnosed with cancer. And I need help with my 4 kids, caring for them. And I'll pay you. I'm like, okay, because I wasn't working and I wasn't at school. And she had a 13-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 9-month-old. So I went to work for her for about 4 years, taking care of her kids and, doing other things. But when she got the news from the doctors that they did all they could, she presented my mom and me with a plan that she had researched for probably almost a year or more about this new concept back then called hospice. She contacted Dame Cicely Saunders in England, who started it there. And then she talked to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I actually had the honor of being with her when she spoke to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And she came up with a plan, went to her doctors and said, okay, I'm not dying in a hospital. Because back then, children couldn't come to the ICU, which is where they put people who were dying. She says, I put together a plan so I can die at home and you're going to help me. And the doctors went, I don't think so. It's not done. She says, well, you're going to make it be done. And they argued a little bit and they finally surrendered and said, okay, we'll do it your way. And she put every research she'd done and everything she'd put together and gave it right before she died. She gave it to my mom and me. And her name was Janet. And she said, go do. Create a hospice here so other people can die like I'm going to die, either at their home or in a place called hospice. And she died in June of 79. And we went out and pounded the pavement, and my mother put a board of directors together. She eventually found an office space for us in the basement of our church. And they were there for 10 years. And then they got a building out in Rockville. It's still a thriving hospice today, serving over 60,000 patients. And then I think it was 10 years ago or a little bit, they built a hospice house. And the really interesting thing is Janet's husband died in 2005, 2007, at the very hospice house that was created by his wife.
Wow.
Except for nobody in the family knew it. And the reason they didn't know it was because her husband refused to let anybody talk about Janet or anything about her, which was just sad. So when I went to their dad's, I, of course, went to the funeral and everything. She had her service at St. Albans Church in Washington, D.C., which is part of the Washington, the National Cathedral in Washington. And at her service, she had a song done because it was one of her favorite called Morning Has Broken.
Yes.
And this is an Episcopal church. 2 years later, they put it in the hymnal. The entire Episcopal hymnal now has Morning Has Broken. I cry every time I hear it.
Yeah.
All these years later, she was a mentor to me. I watched this woman go through hell with the chemo, the radiation, not being able to care for her children, a husband that didn't do a hell of a lot. And I saw her do all of this with an actual smile on her face. She was determined to stay positive. And I finally said to her one day, Janet, how do you stay so positive? Because 6 months before she was diagnosed, her parents died in a car accident.
Oh, Lord.
And so she was grieving that. And then, her diagnosis. And she looked at me, she says, Liz, I figured out a while ago that right before I go to bed, if I find 3 things to be grateful for in my day, then it's worth going on. And I put it in a journal. And I'm thinking, wow, that's amazing. And the only 2 times I saw this woman cry over a 4-year span was when she found out her oldest child, her only son, was smoking dope, marijuana. And back then it was very illegal. That really broke her heart because he couldn't deal with her having cancer. And the other time, the 9-month-old, I had her on my hip one day, and Joana took a nap. Joana. I'll explain that in a minute. Janet always took a nap in the afternoon, and she had lost all her gorgeous auburn hair. And when she left the bedroom, she either had a wig on or a bandana or something over her head. She didn't want anybody really seeing her bald because she hated it. And so she was coming down the stairs from her nap, and Daphne was on my hip and looked up at her mother. And for the first time ever, when she looked at her mother, she started screaming. And Janet was so like, what's going on? And I went, nothing. I mouthed the word nothing. She went, oh my God. And she went tearing upstairs and put her wig on and came back downstairs, and Daphne was fine. She never did that again. But again, those were the only 2 times in the 4-year span I saw her actually lose it. And the day she died, I was at my apartment about 20 minutes away. My mother called me that morning and said, you better get here now, because it looks like today's the day. And so I got there, and my mom was outside Janet's window playing a card game with the 2 younger daughters, who at that point were 5 and 7, I think, or 4 and 7. And so they were giggling and laughing, and that's how Janet died, hearing her kids giggle and laugh.
She was able to let go, knowing they were okay, basically.
Yes. And it was the most beautiful scene I've ever seen. At that, I mean, I was like 22, about 22, 23 at that point. It was just amazing. It wasn't sad. It was just beautiful.
Yeah.
And that's when I decided that Mom and I both felt so strongly about giving people dignity when they died. Because back then, trust me, it was not happening. And as I said, it was the 3rd hospice in the country. There was one in Florida and one in Connecticut. And we actually opened before the one in LA started. And I worked with my mom for a year, because in the end of 1980, my now ex-husband, but at the time my husband, got a job up here in New England. So we had to move. Tell you what, my heart, the first year I was living here in New Hampshire, I cried every day. I hated it. And what saved me was my dad called me every day to check on me, because I was always his favorite. But I kept tabs with my mom. She'd call me and ask me for advice. I mean, this is a woman who was 50 years old at the time and had never worked since she got married. So this was a big deal, and she did a fabulous job. So it was a few years later that she started working with Josephine Magno. She was the first president of the National Hospice Organization. And she and my mom got Medicare to cover hospice.
Wow. What you have done is such a blessing to the world, honestly.
Thank you.
Honestly, that you turned this whole issue of sadness and grief and people getting sick and accidents into something that helps people every day in this country.
Yeah, I always usually poo-poo it, because it was really my mom. I just helped her.
Yeah,
But
well, Mom was remarkable. No question about that.
she absolutely was remarkable. And I wasn't close with my brother at all. We were 5 years apart in 2 entirely different lives. And when he died, I cried some, but I didn't know how to react. I'm sorry. And when at his funeral, a whole bunch of his college buddies told me about a John I never knew, how he was always there for them. And if anybody got in trouble, John was the first person that that they reached out to. The other amazing thing I didn't know, you know the song by Billy Joel called Piano Man?
Yes.
There's a line in there that says, John at the bar was a friend of mine and he gives me my drinks for free. He wrote that about my brother.
Wow.
And after my brother died, he wrote my parents a letter saying how heartbroken he was. He said, John was the kindest bartender I ever met. So it really changed my perspective on my brother. And then when I moved up here, I helped one of the first hospices here in New Hampshire get started. The first hospice The first big hospice here in New Hampshire was called Home Health and Hospice. And it was the one in Maryland was nonprofit. This one is also still nonprofit. And I worked for them for a while, training volunteers because I had been involved in hospice. And then I went on to other things, like being a mom. I had a daughter in 1982 on April 5th. And I was just, for a long time, just an at-home mom, like my mother was. But at some point, I had to go back to work. I won't bore you with those details, but I had to go back to work. And I was working for a grocery store that had a place called La Carte, which is where we cooked food at the grocery store so people could come buy it and take it home. And in 2004, I had a pot of boiling water full of spaghetti fall off a cart behind me and gave me third-degree burns, and I had to spend 3 months at Mass General's Hospital recovering. And actually, they told me I'd probably never walk again. Well, I proved them wrong. Determination, knowing I didn't want to spend the rest of my life in a wheelchair. The reason I tell you this is because they gave me workers' comp and a settlement, and I needed to find another job in order to not lose my workers' comp. And I was dragging my feet, and I opened the paper one day, and I saw this little teeny ad saying, "Bring your heart to the Beacon Hospice." I went, hospice? To do hospice work again. And they were looking for a volunteer coordinator. And I went for the interview and left with the job. And because of all my experience with hospice. And I worked for them for 8 years. And I was working for them in 2008. And the way they loved me is I felt so blessed, because another issue with grief is companies and stuff and how they treat their employees after a death.
Yes.
And yeah, it's awful. But I was blessed. My boss at Beacon Hospice said, take all the time you need. It started in May when my sister-in-law died of cancer, taken care of by the very hospice my mother and I created. And then on August 6, 2008, my beloved Joana died from a blood clot that the hospital where she lived here in New Hampshire missed. And 10 days after that, my mom died.
Oh,
so in that year, I had 3 deaths within 3 months. But I made the decision when Joana died that I was not going to be my parents. I was not going to shut everybody off when my brother died. I wasn't going to do it that way. And part of it was, I didn't mention, was my mom and dad. My mom found compassionate friends about not quite a year after John died. And it was just starting here in the United States. My mom has a habit of starting things and doing things. And she went to a meeting, and I don't know how she did it, but she got my dad to go with her. And it was going to those meetings for a while that started to heal my parents. And I saw such a difference in them, and that's how I decided I wanted to handle my daughter's death. And my mom and I had a wonderful conversation the night of my daughter's funeral. And my parents were in Williamsburg, Virginia. They'd retired there. They were in an assisted living, and I wasn't going to have them come up here for a funeral. So my mom, 2 important things she said to me that night was, promise me you'll go find a compassionate friends group. They will be the one place that can help you and heal you. And being with other parents who've experienced their child's death, they're the only ones that will really be able to understand and be there. And she was absolutely right. And then right before we hung up, my sister was up from Baltimore helping me get through those first 2 weeks. My mom said, well, I don't want you girls to worry, but they're taking me to the hospital tomorrow because they say something's wrong with my heart. I feel fine. That was always my mother's attitude. Feel fine. The next day, she had a stroke. And 4 days later, she was gone. So I called my sister. We were at a second funeral for my daughter in the town they lived in their little church. And it was a gorgeous August day. And um, it was hot up here, even not always hot up here, but it was. And the sun was shining, and the minister was talking, and all of a sudden we lost power. The sky got very dark, very gray. And poked my husband, and I said, what do you bet my mom just died? And so as soon as the service started, I called my sister. And I said, is mom still alive? She goes, no. I mean, she said, yes. I said, I'm sorry. Should have said that correctly. I said, is mom still here? She goes, yeah. Why? I said, I just had this feeling. Put the phone to her ear. I want to talk to her. Now she was totally almost in a coma. And I said, Mom, it's okay to go now. I know it's what you want. I'm okay. I've got Peter, my husband. I've got, Nathan, my daughter's fiance, and so many great people helping me. You need to go. And then Peter went and called her and talked to her. Now, my parents adore my husband, adored him. And they called him St. Peter because he put up with me. And I said, don't forget to tell her it's St. Peter calling. So he went off and called her. I said, well, he goes, I didn't tell her it was St. Peter because I was afraid I'd confuse her. Oh, humor is such an important part. I know it takes time for a lot of people to get to the humor. Yeah. But so we got in the car. It's an hour drive home. We pulled in the driveway, and my sister called and said, she's gone. She was waiting to hear from you. I just knew it. I didn't grieve my mom a whole lot because I was still reeling from my daughter. But some of the things she said to me on that last phone call were things she didn't want me to do like she did when my brother died. And I said, that's okay, Mom. I get it. I'm not going to.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I have had so many blessings. And even the night Joana died, I was able to write down 3 things I was grateful for. I've been doing that ever since Janet died. And that's been 50 years.
Liz, you are such an inspiration. And all of the things that you covered today are things that people who have experienced lots of losses have to look at. You talked about losing family, losing a job, having your health jeopardized. You've had so many different things that you've had to contend with, and yet you do it with grace.
Thank you.
And I'm very honored to have met you and very grateful to you that you shared your story with us. And I hope that you'll come back, and people may have questions for you or may want to comment. And I invite you to come back and thank you so much for being part of this project this month. It's a blessing to me.
Thank you. I was honored to be able to do this. I know that, I've heard it a lot, how brave I am and all, but it's actually all a choice.
Yes, ma'am.
And one last thing before we go. I am so blessed because Joanna's fiance is still in our lives these almost 18 years later.
Yeah.
His name is Nathan, and he is such a sweetheart. And a couple weeks after Joanna died, I said, Nathan, if you need to move on, I understand. And so does Peter. And he said, what are you talking about? I'm not going anywhere. You're family.
Well, he adopted you.
Yes, he did. And I also told him a couple years later, I think it was 3 years later, when he took me out to dinner one night to tell me that he had asked the woman he was kind of seeing for a year or so, but they'd known each other a lot longer. Um, he was going to ask her to marry him. And I started laughing. I said, Nathan, how stupid do you think Peter and I are? We've watched you and Haley grow, and we couldn't be happier. And I said, you could have fallen in love with someone who never knew Joana. And she probably would have said to you, you need to be done with that family because that's weird. He said, I never would have done that to you.
That's love.
So it is, but it's also a blessing because that doesn't happen very often.
That's
I only
correct.
know one other couple or one other mom who lost her only son that has had that happen as well.
Well, you have had some life. This has been some ride for you.
Sure has. And it hasn't been all fun, trust me, or
No, it
all
hasn't,
easy.
but you did it again, like I said, with grace. And you are an amazing person, and I'm so grateful to you.
Oh, hey, thank you. I have a
Well,
hard
you're
time.
welcome.
I have a hard time. I have a hard time hearing nice things
Well, you
about
can
myself
soak
when I'm
that little
getting,
bit in. You can soak
yeah,
that a little bit in. You can think about it after we finish today. So I'm just going to say bye for now, and
yes,
hopefully we'll see you again soon.
thank you
Thank you,
very much.
Liz. Bye-bye.
Bye.